My older brother tried to sell my late husband's company 3 months after the funeral. He did not tell me, he did not ask me. He told the buyer that I, the widow, had already signed off on the sale. He told the buyer that I was not in a state to be involved in business decisions. He told the buyer that the company was underwater and that we needed to move quickly. None of those things were true. I want to tell you what stopped my brother, because it was not me. It was not a lawyer. It was not the SEC. It was not anyone in my family. It was the buyer, a man named Marcus, a man I had never met. Marcus picked up his phone on a Tuesday afternoon in October, after 10 weeks of negotiations with my brother, and he decided, for reasons he later told me he could not fully explain, that he wanted to hear in my own voice why I was so insistent on selling fast. My phone rang at 3:20 p.m. I picked it up, and in the next 19 minutes, my brother's entire scheme collapsed. My name is Linda. I am 62 years old. 3 weeks ago, my brother lost his job, his reputation in our small Connecticut town, and, by his own admission to the FBI, his ability to ever again hold a position of fiduciary trust in the state of Connecticut. All because Marcus, a stranger, decided to make a phone call he was not technically required to make. Let me tell you exactly what happened. My husband's name was Tom. Tom was a quiet man. He was an engineer by training. We met in 1988, when I was 26 and he was 28. We married in 1989. We were married for 36 years. Tom started his manufacturing company, a small machining shop that made specialized metal parts for medical devices, in 1994, 6 years into our marriage, with $9,000 he had saved from his engineer salary and a $15,000 loan from his father. By the time Tom died in February of this year of a stroke, at the age of 63, the company was worth, by an independent valuation conducted 6 months before his death, just over $3.8 million. Tom had named me as the sole owner in his will. He had named, separately, my older brother, Greg, as the executor of his estate. Tom had explained that decision to me once, in 2019, with a kind of nervous laugh. He had said, "Linda, sweetheart, your brother is going to be hurt if I don't give him something to do. Making him executor doesn't cost us anything, and it keeps the peace with your family. I love your brother. He is fine." I had said, "Tom, are you sure?" Tom had said, "It is just paperwork, sweetheart. He files some forms. He signs the death certificate. He helps with the funeral. The actual ownership of everything is yours. The will is very clear." I said, "Okay." I trusted my brother. I want you to understand that. I did not have, in 2019, any reason to suspect that the older brother who had walked me down the aisle in 1989, who had been the godfather of my son, who had been at every Thanksgiving for 36 years, would do what he was about to do. My brother Greg is 66. He is 4 years older than I am. Greg had been, for most of our adult lives, what our mother used to call almost successful. He had a degree in business administration from a state college. He had worked as a regional manager for a medium-sized insurance company for 31 years before he was let go in 2018, at the age of 59, in what he told us was a restructuring. He had been semi-retired since then. He did some consulting, he played a lot of golf, he had a modest savings, a modest home, and a wife named Karen who had retired from teaching 3 years earlier. Greg had been, for most of our adult lives, polite to Tom, but quietly resentful of him. Tom, the engineer, had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. Greg, the businessman, had spent 31 years rising to the position of regional manager at an insurance company and had been let go at 59 with a small severance. My brother had spent the last 6 years of his life watching his younger sister's husband become wealthier than he would ever be. I did not, in 2019, register what that meant. I should have.
Tom died on a Friday in February. Greg gave the eulogy. He cried real tears. He told the story of how he had introduced me to Tom at a college party in 1988. He told everyone in the church how much he loved his brother-in-law. On Monday morning, 3 days after the funeral, Greg called me and asked if he could start handling the executor paperwork. He told me he wanted to take some of the burden off me while I was grieving. I said yes. I did not realize that what Greg meant by start handling the paperwork was start looking for a buyer for my company you do not yet realize is fully mine. Greg started looking for buyers on Wednesday after the funeral. I now know this because the FBI told me. They walked me through the timeline 3 weeks ago in a small conference room in their Hartford field office with my attorney sitting next to me. On Wednesday morning, Greg made his first call to a business broker. He told the broker that he was the executor of an estate, that the deceased had left a manufacturing company to his unfortunately quite confused widow, and that the family wanted to sell the company quickly because the widow could not handle the responsibility. The broker, a man named Daniel, did what most business brokers would do. He pulled together a list of potential buyers. He started circulating a brief summary of the company. He scheduled a series of introductory calls. Within 4 weeks, Greg had narrowed it down to 3 serious bidders. Within 6 weeks, the lead bidder had emerged, a man named Marcus, a man who owned a similar machining business in northern New Jersey. He had been quietly looking to expand into Connecticut for 2 years. Marcus had offered $2.1 million for the company. The independent valuation that Tom had commissioned 6 months before his death had established the company's fair market value at $3.8 million. Greg had told the broker that the valuation that Marcus had been shown, which Greg himself had prepared in a 1-page summary, drawing on internal financial documents he had obtained by going through Tom's home office without my knowledge, was optimistic and that the actual fair value was closer to $2 million. In other words, my brother had been preparing to sell my company, a company I did not yet realize was legally mine, for $1.7 million net below its actual market value. Why would he do that, you may be asking? Because Greg had structured the deal to include, as part of the closing terms, a $140,000 executor fee, a number wildly above the standard executor compensation for an estate of that size in Connecticut, which would have been closer to $30,000. Plus a transition consulting agreement that would have paid Greg for the next 5 years $20,000 a month to assist with the integration. My brother's plan was to sell the company quickly, well below market value, in exchange for a personal fee structure that would net him approximately $1.3 million over 5 years. And he had been planning to tell me, after the sale closed, that the company was sold for $1.7 million net to the estate, of which I would receive $800,000 after expenses, taxes, and estate administration costs. I would have, by his calculation, been grateful. I would have, in his words to Karen on a phone call the FBI would later show me a transcript of, never known the difference. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, 10 weeks after Tom died, my home phone rang. I picked it up at 3:20 p.m. I was sitting at my kitchen table looking at the backyard where Tom had built a small bird feeder in 2003. The voice on the other end said, "Hello, is this Linda Markham?" I said, "Yes." The voice said, "Mrs. Markham, my name is Marcus. I am sorry to bother you. I am the gentleman who has been negotiating with your brother Greg for the purchase of Tom Markham Manufacturing Company. I want to be very honest with you, ma'am. I have been negotiating for 10 weeks. The papers are scheduled to be signed on Friday, but I want to be sure of something before I sign. Can you confirm for me that you have personally reviewed and approved the sale terms?" There was a long silence on the line. Then I said, very carefully, "Marcus, I have not heard about any sale. I have not approved anything. I am the widow of Tom Markham. I did not know my brother had been negotiating with anyone. There was a longer silence on the other end. Then Marcus said, "Oh, I see. Mrs. Markham, may I call you back in 15 minutes? I need to make a phone call first, and then I think you and I have some things to talk about." That's the end of Block 1. Block 2 begins 15 minutes later when Marcus called me back, and it ends 3 weeks later with my brother Greg sitting in handcuffs in his own driveway.
Marcus called me back at 3:36 p.m. He told me, very calmly, that he had spent the previous 15 minutes calling his attorney. He said, "Mrs. Markham, I want to walk you through what has been happening because I think you have not been told. I am going to send you, by courier, a complete file of every document I have received from your brother over the past 10 weeks, the valuation summary, the executor fee structure, the transition consulting agreement, the proposed bill of sale, everything. I want you to have it before you decide what to do." I said, "Okay." Marcus said, "Mrs. Markham, I am going to ask you a question and I am going to need an honest answer. Did you know that the company is, by the will Tom filed in 2014, your sole property as of his death? Greg has been telling me you are a partial beneficiary with me and that he has authority as executor to sell on behalf of the estate." I sat down. I said, "Marcus, I knew the will named me as the sole owner. I have a copy of it in my filing cabinet. My brother is the executor, but he should not have the authority to sell anything without my written, notarized permission." Marcus said, "Oh, then we have a real problem here, Mrs. Markham, because everything your brother has been telling me for 10 weeks is fraudulent." I asked Marcus why he had decided to call me. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "Mrs. Markham, I have been buying and selling small machining businesses for 22 years. I have done this 15, 16 times. The thing about your brother that has been bothering me since about week 3 is that the rush has been very specific. Most estates take 12 to 18 months to settle, even when the family wants to move fast. Your brother has been pushing for a closing date inside of 14 weeks from the funeral, and every time I asked to speak directly with the widow, I was told you were too distraught, traveling, with family, not in a state to handle business. Last week, Greg told me you had moved into a senior living facility and were not taking outside calls." I said, "I live in my own house. I have not moved." Marcus said, "Yes, ma'am, I gathered. So this morning, I asked my paralegal to do a property records check on the address Greg gave me as your forwarding address. The address Greg gave me does not exist. There is no senior living facility at that address. There's a Walgreens." I closed my eyes. Marcus said, "Mrs. Markham, I want you to know something. I almost didn't make this call. I have a closing in 3 days. The deal is favorable for me. I make money on this deal even at the inflated price your brother quoted. I almost let it go through. The reason I didn't, the reason I picked up the phone, was because my own mother was a widow when I was 23, and a man came around to her after my father died who tried to convince her to sell my father's small auto shop for less than half its value. He told her she was not in a state to make business decisions. My older sister stopped that sale. I have spent 22 years promising myself that if I ever found myself on the other side of one of those situations, the one where I could see what was happening but the widow couldn't, I would not be the man who closed the deal. I would be the man who picked up the phone. So today, I picked up the phone. I cried for the first time in 3 weeks. Marcus introduced me, on his recommendation, to a Hartford attorney named Joan Pemberton, who specialized in estate fraud. Joan called me at 5 p.m. that same Tuesday. She had me come to her office at 9 the next morning with the will, with my filing cabinet records, and with the file Marcus had sent by courier. By Wednesday evening, Joan had assembled a complete picture. My brother, Greg, had over the previous 10 weeks prepared and circulated approximately 42 documents that contained material misrepresentations of fact. He had forged a power of attorney that was supposed to give him authority to sell on my behalf, a document I had never signed.
He had altered Tom's original valuation report to lower the market value. He had drafted internal memos suggesting I had consented to sale terms I had never seen. Joan said, "Linda, this is no longer just a civil matter. Your brother has committed federal wire fraud, mail fraud, and forgery in the conduct of an interstate business transaction. We need to bring in the FBI." I asked Joan if I could think about it overnight. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my brother. I thought about my mother, who had died in 2017, and what she would say if she knew. I thought about Tom. I thought about the careful way Tom had always said, "Your brother is family," not "Your brother is reliable." I called Joan in the morning. I said, "Call the FBI. I want this on the record." The FBI built the case in 3 weeks. They had every document Greg had circulated because Marcus had preserved them all. They had recordings of phone calls Greg had made to other potential bidders because Marcus's broker had recorded those calls in the normal course of business. They had bank records showing where the executor fee was meant to be deposited. They had the recorded phone call between Greg and Karen, his wife, in which Greg had laid out the plan in plain language, never imagining anyone outside the family would ever hear it. On a Thursday morning in November, 2 FBI agents pulled into Greg's driveway in Stamford. They knocked on his door. They informed him he was under arrest for federal wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery, and attempted breach of fiduciary duty. They handcuffed him. They walked him to their car. Karen stood in the driveway, in her brothrobe, watching. I was not there. I was at my kitchen table drinking coffee when Joan called me to tell me it had happened. Greg pleaded guilty within 10 days. His attorney told him there was no defense. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 38 months in federal prison. He paid restitution of $140,000 to my legal expenses, drawn from his retirement savings, which Karen had to liquidate to cover his legal fees. Karen, my sister-in-law of 40 years, has not spoken to me since. That is, on balance, fine. She had known what Greg was doing. The FBI confirmed it. I do not need her in my life. I kept Tom's company. I hired a new general manager, a woman named Patricia, who had been Tom's second-in-command for 12 years and who loved him like a brother. I gave her a 5% equity stake. She runs the day-to-day. I sit in on quarterly meetings. The company has grown by 15% in revenue since I took ownership. Marcus, the buyer who refused to participate in the fraud, became a friend. He bought a different machining company in northern Massachusetts 6 months later, one that was for sale legitimately, by an actual heir who was actually authorized. We talk on the phone every few months. His wife and I have had dinner. We exchange holiday cards. My brother, Greg, is in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. He has written me 4 letters from prison. I have not opened them any. I do not need to. I keep Marcus's number written on a small index card taped to the inside of my filing cabinet where Tom's will is kept. It is taped there as a reminder. Some people will spend 10 weeks trying to take everything from you, and then a complete stranger will pick up the phone on a Tuesday afternoon and ask one extra question. Both kinds of people exist in this world. It is good to remember that when you're in the middle of finding out which kind your brother is. If you has ever been the family member nobody expected to understand business, if you have ever been quietly excluded from decisions that were legally yours to make, if you have ever been saved by a stranger who simply asked one extra question, leave one word in the comments below. The word is buyer, for every woman who was almost cheated by family and saved by someone outside it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. We share a new one every week about quiet women who knew exactly what they were doing the entire time everyone underestimated them. Until then, pick up the phone. Somebody, somewhere, may be waiting for you to ask the question they couldn't.